WBNE.
Hello, and welcome to episode 148, all about the Silmarillion, Chapter 9, of the Flight of the Noldor, being the 148th part of That's What I'm Tolkien About. My name is Mary Clay. If that's too complicated for you, just call me MC. I've been experiencing the world of J.R.R. Tolkien for the first time, and right now I am reading the Silmarillion, so you don't have to. Today I'm joined by Dan, aka the voice of Geekdom. Welcome!
Thank you, Mary. Thank you for the invitation. It's good to be here.
Thank you so much for coming on, especially for, holy cow, a packed chapter, which we will get into.
Yeah, it's a zinger of the chapter. It's one of my favorites.
Yes, a zinger indeed. What, like, a perfect word, I think, to describe it.
Yeah, I was really pleased when you asked me to do this particular chapter, actually. I asked you which chapter you wanted me to do, and I was actually hoping for this one. So.
Oh, good. Yeah, I was really intimidated by this one, just looking ahead at, like, the table of contents, just because this one, most of the chapters have been, like, 2 to 6 pages so far, and this one was 10, and so I was like, oh boy, this one's a bit longer. This one's probably going to be, it might be harder for me to get through or read, because is it going to be like longer? Is it going to be, but it was like, I had no trouble reading it, and I was like flying through the pages surprisingly, and
but a lot happens though in those 10 pages.
Oh my gosh, yeah, like so much, yeah. But before we dive into that, why don't you tell me and the listeners a little bit about how you got into Tolkien and Lord of the Rings, whether that was through Lord of the Rings or The Hobbit or the movies or the books. What was that like?
Yeah, so I've been a lifelong fan, really. I first read The Hobbit when I was around about 6. Actually, my dad read it to me when I was in hospital. I was having my grommets put in my ears, and so my dad read it while I was in hospital recovering from that, and he ended up reading it to the entire ward of all the other kids who gathered round and were all listening.
Oh, that's so sweet.
And so that was my first experience with Tolkien. And then I immediately took the book off him and read it myself. So I read The Hobbit myself at that age. And then it wasn't very long before we did the same thing with The Lord of the Rings. So my dad read that first, and then I read it afterwards, probably around the age of 8. So pretty young to be reading The Lord of the Rings. And so I came to it before the movies. And the movies came out when I was around about 15 or so. And so that was another wave of Tolkien fandom that kind of came back again because I got into the books again at that point. I've read The Lord of the Rings countless times. Shortly after I read in The Lord of the Rings, I read the Silmarillion, and initially the Silmarillion was too difficult for me at that young age. It's not the longest book, the Silmarillion, but it's a very weird book with a lot of names, a lot of Elvish, a lot of old fangled language, and it's got a different kind of narrative voice to it that just sort of doesn't really kind of come off in the same way to a child.
Yeah, for sure.
And so initially I didn't take that much from it other than reading the Beren and Luthien chapter, which I knew the story already from The Lord of the Rings. And so I kind of came back to that and knew that story better when I reread The Lord of the Rings again, which, I took something from my first read of the Silmarillion, but it was a few more years before I read the Silmarillion again. And yeah, it's just always been a lifelong passion. It's one of my first fandoms and first loves in literature, and it's been an ever present in my life, really.
And what was it that made you just decide to start your YouTube channel and dive into it with the depth that you are doing right now?
Well, I started my YouTube channel around about spring 2020, which...
oh, yeah. I'm familiar.
found myself with a lot of extra spare time on my hands at that point. So I didn't have a lot of work at the time. And so I found myself with a lot of free time. And I made a friend online. A friend of mine, Helen, the Clueless Fangirl, is her YouTube channel. And so she we became friendly through Twitter, and just I was a fan of her channel because she was going into these deep dive lore discussion, podcast type discussions about Silmarillion lore and stuff like that, and doing content that no one else was really doing. We became friendly through Twitter and so on, and she asked me to come on her channel. So my first kind of dipping my toes into doing this kind of online content creation was on her channel as a guest. Somebody that you should have on your podcast in the future if you can get her.
Yes, for sure. She
point.
is, to pull back the curtain a little bit, I keep a nice, not creepy at all list of potential guests. You were on it, so don't worry. And she is on that list too as well, so I'm sure at some point or another I will be reaching out to her.
Yeah, so we've become really good friends over the last couple of years, and so that was my first dip in my toes, and she kind of egged me on to making my own channel. So I started in the summer that year, and I started with the Silmarillion. So I have a long running series on my channel where I do a little bit different to this, but I do the Silmarillion chapter by chapter. And it's very much short form scripted content where I will read excerpts and then discuss them and introduce some of the key themes, and also with the aid of visual aids. So I'll include maps and
very helpful
and fully sourced fan art and that sort of thing that can help first time readers to understand the concept a bit better, and also to familiarize themselves visually with the characters. I think helps.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, listeners, as always, stuff will be linked in the episode description, so make sure to go check out those videos if you want kind of like a companion piece if you're reading along with me, or if you want some more visual elements, or you want someone to explain it more piece by piece. Definitely go check that out, because it seems like a really great resource to have as you're reading the Silmarillion, which, as we all know by now, is there's just always a lot going on. Sorry, I don't know if you can hear that obnoxious car.
I can hear you.
Oh my gosh. So rude. But yes, yeah, I think, as I was saying, the Silmarillion is very dense, and there's always so much going on. So any, extra resources we can all find to help us piece things together. This is through my own laziness. I've mentioned a lot on previous episodes of I need to look up a better map, because the map that's in the back of my book is just of Beleriand, and which is great for, I'm sure, the later half of the Silmarillion, but in these first couple chapters where everything's happening in Valinor, there's that's not included on the map, and so I'm I don't know where these islands are, and they're just north and south of each other, I guess. So
yeah, it's very hard to picture actually where things are in relation to one another. There's also Angband isn't on the Beleriand map either, so Angband is Morgoth's fortress. We haven't really been properly introduced to yet at this point in the book, but it's a very important location in a lot of the stories from here on outward. And it's just not on the map, which is baffling, actually. I've had some really wonderful listeners post something on social media and tag me or send it to my DMs, and it's just through my own laziness that I just haven't gotten around to, looking up something to have as a, side by side as I'm reading along. Yeah, one thing I recommended in my series was Karen Wynne Fonstad's Atlas of Middle-earth is an excellent resource. It's got maps from all three ages of Arda, and it's got detailed maps of locations and kind of paths of different population growths and climates and all sorts. She's a was a professional cartographer. She did a full study of everything. It's a really interesting book. That's so cool. Yeah, I think you're probably, if my stupid brain that holds 5 brain cells now at this point in Tolkien world, I think there have been previous guests who have recommended that. So clearly, it's a very highly regarded resource. So yeah. All right, cool. So now let's dive into this hefty chapter where so much happens, and boy is it dramatic. I love it. Dan, for your context, I've said in previous episodes that some of my favorite parts of Tolkien and his stories are the most dramatic, the most extra, the messiest parts of the story, and it gets messy here.
for sure. So
yeah, we really see a whole different side to the elves that
oh my
you've
gosh.
certainly never seen before at this point.
Yeah.
Feanor he's borderline evil with a small e, I call him.
Yeah.
There's capital E evil. There's the Dark Lords, and there's the kind of the big evil, and then there's your garden variety evil, and Feanor's just a small e evil, I call him.
Yeah, no, that's a perfect way to describe it too. And of course, like, that's very true to life, that like their life isn't split into like good guys and bad guys. There are people who we expect to be the good guys, and there are of course going to be bad seeds among them. And that's just, and Tolkien, did that with Lord of the Rings too, where we have Saruman, who is supposed to be our good guy and ends up being corrupt and evil, but evil in a different way than Sauron is evil, and so I just love how true to life that is, that, the reality is not bad guys and good guys. There's gray areas in between, and Feanor is clearly someone who thinks he's a good guy and is going about everything the exact wrong way.
Yeah, he's a little different to Saruman in that Saruman is kind of the ends justify the means, and then that kind of that argument takes over until the point where he becomes too power hungry to really recognize how evil he's become. Whereas Feanor is just kind of an explosion of anger and angst and jealousy.
Oh my gosh, angst with a capital A. I'll say he's evil with a lowercase e, but angst with a capital A.
Yeah, he's like a petulant teenager. He acts, and we've seen this from him already. We saw how he interacted with his half brother back in chapter 7. And we've seen this from him already. We know what kind of character he is, but he takes it up a notch in this chapter. I find him a fascinating character. Wonderful to read.
Yeah, exactly. He's not like, he may not be everyone's like favorite character in terms of like, oh, he like, I want to emulate his qualities, or I admire his values, or I connect to him or something, but like, he's interesting to read. He makes the story good to read.
As far as his qualities as well, I mean, I think in the next chapter, I think it is, we are told that Feanor is the greatest of all the children of Ilúvatar. So he's the greatest elf or man to ever exist. And there's a long list of superlatives that Tolkien's narrator gives us about Feanor, that he's the most beautiful, the most skilled, and he's given more superlatives than any character in the book, other than maybe Luthien. And so he's a special person in history. I guess the second greatest of the Noldor that we're told is Galadriel elsewhere in other sources. And those two have an interesting relationship too. But yeah, I'm waffling, so we should probably get into the story.
Let's do that. So first up, I'm not going to read the whole opening paragraph of this chapter, but wow, I just found it really beautiful. I mean, it's like what it's describing is really depressing and despairing, but of course Tolkien, just being such an expert writer, the way he described everything was just so vivid, and I could like really feel what the Valar are feeling in this moment, where reminder everyone, and previously on the Silmarillion, Ungoliant and Melkor have teamed up, and they have killed the trees of Valinor, and the light has been sucked out and gone out in Valinor. And so now they are just immersed in kind of darkness with a capital D. And it says, Yavanna arose and stood upon Azelohar, the green mound, but it was bare now and black. And she laid her hands upon the trees, but they were dead and dark. And they're falling lifeless in her hands, and they're hearing all of these cries of lamentation across the land. Manwe is just kind of standing up there, like, I guess, like in a daze of just like, what has happened? And This sentence, oh my God, I love it. So it says, it seemed to those that mourned that they had drained to the dregs the cup of woe that Melkor had filled for them, but it was not so. And I just love that. Drained to the dregs the cup of woe. Absolutely. Just, I was just like, okay, Tolkien, like, I make fun of him a lot, but he's just, I would say at least once every chapter, if not more, there's always an instance where I'm like, that's so amazing. I never would have thought to write those words in that order in such a beautiful way.
Yeah, the alliteration of drain to the dregs is really, really nice, isn't it?
So Yavanna comes over and they're all kind of having a council, a meeting, regrouping everything, and says, there's no way I can bring the trees back to life. However, if I could tap into some of their light, I could maybe do that. And to do that, we need the Silmarils. And immediately I'm like, I see where this is going. And Feanor is probably also sitting there like, I also see where this is going.
Yeah.
So they essentially ask Feanor, who, remember, they were all just having this party. Feanor had been commanded to come by Manwë. And he comes and he is not wearing the Silmarils. He's not dressed up for a party in any sense of the word. He's there kind of in protest almost. So they say, Feanor, will you please give us the Silmarils so that we can use the light that you have captured to bring back the trees of Valinor and relight Valinor and you know, release us from this eternal darkness and help and save everyone. And Feanor's like, he's quiet for a minute. And then he says, I don't think so, because that would make me really sad, because then the Silmarils would be broken and I wouldn't have them. And
well, what he actually says is I will die if I could. It may be in my power to release the light and do that, but I would die in the attempt. Which I tend to wonder whether he's actually telling us the truth there. I don't know whether that's necessarily true.
Or if he's just toying with everyone's emotions of do you really want this to kill me?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, he could be manipulating them. He could be manipulating himself. He could be convincing himself that is true, because the Silmarils are so important in his own mind that he thinks that he wouldn't survive their loss. So I tend to wonder about the veracity of everything that he says in this chapter, honestly.
Oh, yeah, definitely, 100%. He says, I must break them, I shall break my heart, and I shall be slain. And then he says, first of all the Eldar in Aman. And then Mandos, very ominously, says, not the first. And everyone's kind of like, okay, I don't know what that means, but all right.
Okay, then Mandos, you weirdo.
Yeah. And at first I was like, oh, does he mean Miriel, Feanor's mom, who she died? But she also died in like a weird elf way where like she doesn't technically die. Like her spirit was so decayed and broken that it just like left her body eventually. So like she didn't die, I guess, in our traditional sense of the word. So
she died. She died like Padme died in Revenge of the Sith. It was that kind of death. It was like she died of a broken heart.
Yeah, exactly.
Like, not exactly, but.
Does that count as when he says, I will be slain, first of all, the Eldar, and then Mandos says, not the first?
He says, I will be slain, which I take that to mean that would be something that would be done to him. You know, it would be a violation of him. And so he would be the first to be slain. Yeah.
In that moment, at first, I was like, wow, that was like really deep of Mandos to remind Feanor of his mother who died, who he is saying, I will be the first of all the Eldar. But as we will see in a moment, that is not who he is speaking about. So they're all kind of sitting around having this council, this debate about what to do. And before they can ever really reach a conclusion, word comes that at Feanor's fortress where he had been exiled to with Finwe, his father, and his sons, who he took with him.
As an aside, Finwe, what do you think of
Yes.
Finwe? A pretty awful father, right? I mean, or at least a weak father.
It seems like a very tragic situation where he seemed to be a great leader, I think with great potential, but then what happened with his first wife is of course very sad, and it's hard because it's like he created Feanor in some sense to be who he is now and what he does in this chapter by like kind of always giving him whatever he wants and stuff. But at the same time, like, how can you judge a father who is looking at their child whose mother has died and like not want to give them everything? So like that I understand. But yeah, he does just kind of seem like a very beaten down leader and father figure where he doesn't really seem to have much of a spine anymore and doesn't really seem to be doing much in any like the chapter where I think it was the unrest of the Noldor a couple chapters ago where Thingolfin comes to Finwe and is alerting him to what Feanor is saying and doing and is saying you need to step up and do something, and he doesn't really respond or say anything to that. And it seems that now his sons have kind of taken over with him just being like, I guess this is what's happening. Yeah.
There's a lack of leadership from him, I think, and his parenting role seems to be to enable his wild son, and favoritism in parenthood is never a good thing.
Yeah, to say the least.
But yeah, it's a particularly pointed example of that because he's responsible for a lot of the issues that I think arise in the psyche of his sons, and a lot of the problems that Melkor is able to capitalize on arise from his poor parenting.
Yeah, I definitely think if he would step up as more of a leader, like later in this chapter we see Olwe, who is the leader of the Teleri, and he is like a great leader and he really stands up for his people and stands up against Feanor. Again, we'll get there in a second. And meanwhile, Finwe, I feel like if he stepped up and took the lead and spoke out against his sons having this fight and everything and said, stop listening to Melkor, then we maybe wouldn't be in this situation, you know? So, definitely.
It's as though a piece of him died when his first wife died.
Yes,
and
exactly.
He never really recovered from that, I think.
Yeah.
There's I mentioned this in my Silmarillion series, but there's a really interesting text that Tolkien worked on about Finwe and Miriel, and about what happened when she died, because that was something strange and otherworldly that happened to her when she died. It wasn't supposed, like, that had never happened before, and the Valar were surprised by it. They didn't think that could happen, that an elf could just die. You know, we would call it, as humans, we would call it of natural causes, like she died in childbirth, like we would think nothing of it. But for an elf, that's a weird thing to happen. Like, it's bizarre.
It's unheard of, yeah.
And so they kind of had this debate amongst themselves, and they actually make a new law as a result of it, which kind of allows for posthumous divorce, basically, whereby Finwe is able to remarry. And so they make this ruling, the Valar do. But they also discuss the fact that Miriel dies and that she has her death is as a result of the marring of Arda, which is kind of like a concept whereby the world has become corrupt because of the first evil of Melkor. His role in the music of the Ainur like introduces a seed of evil to the universe, basically. It's very sort of biblical in terms of its theological composition, that aspect of the mythology. But yeah, it's an interesting topic. And if you are looking for more Tolkien to read after the Silmarillion, I would recommend that section of Morgoth's Ring, because it's the Miriel story that's in the Silmarillion is kind of very short and sweet, but it also doesn't really go anywhere, and it doesn't seem to sort of fit with any kind of narrative. It's just kind of, it gets Feanor and Finwe to where they have to be, but but she's just sort of written out of it. What ends up happening to her is she becomes this spirit in the halls of the dead, and she's working for one of the Valar there, and spinning these tapestries where she's weaving these tapestries of the history of the Noldor as they're happening. So she's like watching all of the tragedy that's going to happen in the next, 10 chapters. She's going to be watching it and weaving it in these tapestries, which is
adds another layer of context to it for sure.
Horrible fate. But yeah, it's a really important event, Feanor's birth, because we're told that he is so overwhelming in terms of the power and fire of his spirit, that she just doesn't. It drains her, and she doesn't survive. Yeah. And then he goes on to have a record amount of children. So he has 7 sons, and that's like unheard of. There's none of the elves have that many children. So yeah, it's really weird.
It's a lot. Yeah, it's definitely all a domino effect of all of these things setting up to lead to the events that, are happening as we're reading them. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, word arrives that from the fortress where they had been exiled to and were staying, Melkor and the Darkness reached their fortress and stole the Silmarils and the rest of the gems and jewels and everything that had been hoarded there. And also, Finwe has been killed. He has been slain. So that is what Mandos meant by when he says, when Feanor says, I will be the first of all the Eldor slain in Aman, and then Mandos says not the first, because he already knows, kind of being, the equivalent of Hades and like Lord of the Underworld, so to speak. He already knows that this has happened before word reaches them. So Finwe has been killed and the Silmarils have been taken. So the worst for Feanor has happened, and he is obviously angry. And this is when he officially names Melkor Morgoth, the black foe of the world. And this is what he is referred to by the Eldar, I guess, going forward. And so the rest of the chapter goes back and forth between saying Melkor and Morgoth. So I also might flip back and forth between saying Morgoth and Melkor, but everyone should know those are the same person. And Morgoth is just the like ultimate evil name that they have created for him.
It's like an insult. It's like they're cursing him by calling him that. It says, the narrator says the Eldar will refer to him as Morgoth forever after, which means in dialogue he'll always be referred to as Morgoth, but the narrator will switch back and forth between the two. Primarily, the narrator also refers to him as Morgoth from this point onwards, but yeah.
Yeah. So, of course, Feanor is very mad. He's mad at Melkor, now Morgoth, of course. And he's also mad, he's mad at the Valar. He's mad at everyone, of course, because he, in particular, he feels that if he had been there, if he hadn't been summoned to this party, he could have single-handedly defeated Melkor, and here's all these of course they were all at this party and they didn't know that this darkness was coming, so maybe if they had been in like battle stance, maybe it would have been different, if they hadn't been caught by surprise. But here's
it wouldn't have been that different. I don't think the Noldor could have done a whole lot.
Who knows? But here is Feanor, this single elf, being like, I could have defeated them if I had been there. So he's very mad. He feels that he could have stopped all of this if he hadn't been summoned to this party. But of course, the irony is that he did not bring the Silmarils with him because he wanted to deprive everyone else of their presence. He was like, if I'm going to come here, you're not going to get to look at the Silmarils. I know that that's what everyone loves to see. Like, that's my party trick, and I'm not doing it, And if he had brought them, there's a good chance, Melkor maybe would have thought that they were at his fortress and still would have gone. I mean, who knows? Maybe Melkor still would have ended up with the Silmarils if Feanor had brought them to Valmar. But point being is that Feanor's own I don't know, pride, I guess, is what left the Silmarils unattended and got them stolen. And maybe if the Silmarils also, maybe if they hadn't been there, maybe Finwe wouldn't have been killed. Maybe Melkor would have gotten there, realized the Silmarils weren't there, and then just left. Maybe Finwe was trying to defend.
Possibly. There's an element of self-hate, I think, in Fëanor at this point, because he's blaming himself, but he's blaming everybody else by proxy for that blame that he has for himself, you know, because I think he has a very natural guilt about not having been there to defend his father. We are told, actually, to his credit as well, that he values his father's life above the Silmarils and everything else. So his love of his father is his one redeeming trait, really, at this point. Morally speaking. But he has this. I kind of think he has this guilt and self-hatred that drives him in this moment. And also, of course, he's also responding to the lies that Melkor had already been planting in him for some time. So he already has this perception of the Valar as being like Melkor and coveting the works of his hands, his Silmarils.
Yeah, it's really, and kind of later on in the chapter too, it's really crazy that, like, after all Melkor has done in this chapter, there's still a part of Fëanor that believes what Melkor has told him, that, like, oh yeah, the Valar just brought you here because they were jealous of what, you know, your potential would be in Middle Earth by yourselves, and so they wanted to keep an eye on you, and they're just keeping you here for their own selfish reasons and everything. And so these lies that Melkor has planted in Fëanor, even after, you know, he is revealed to be evil, Fëanor still believes them, which is what's truly incredible. That I'm like, really, Fëanor, even after all this, you're still believing this guy?
It's not like he believes him. I think he tricks himself into thinking that there is some truth to some of what Melkor is saying. Yeah, it's like Melkor is like telling lies using the truth, and he plays 3-dimensional chess with Fëanor, and he wins. You know, he's too much, moves ahead all the time, and
for sure,
it's very clever how he works that angle. It's similar to what we see like later on in the mythology from Sauron. Sauron does similar stuff in the Second Age when he makes the Rings of Power. You know, he also uses the same sort of tactics where he turns people against each other with using elements of the truth but spinning lies within it, and it's a similar path that those two characters are on. So speaking of Morgoth, Melkor, whatever you want to call him, it mentions what he is doing. So he and Ungoliant escape across the Helcaraxe. Did I say that right? More or less, yeah. Helcaraxe,
okay.
Yeah.
Helcaraxe. Okay, great. Which is the like ice mass bridge sort of that is connecting. It's to the north, so it's very dangerous to pass, but it is the only way to cross from Valinor to Middle Earth if you like don't have a boat or anything, or you don't have an all-powerful sea god just like lifting you across, which is how some of them got there in the first place. So they cross and they make it to Middle Earth, and now Ungoliant, she has been promised essentially like, I will give you whatever you want to feast on. And previously, during this whole, you know, darkness and everything that's happened, Melkor was watching her feast on like the trees and everything. And like there was so much that he was like, she will never be satisfied. And I don't know what to do now. So she says, give me the gems that we just stole. So I'm just laughing a lot at Melkor. He's like in the face of Ungoliant, who is at this point one of the only people or beings that Melkor is afraid of. And he like basically like hides the Silmarils in one hand behind his back and then gives her the rest of the gems that they had stolen and jewels. And so she eats all of those. And then she says, and now the other hand.
Yeah. That's quite a comical image. You're not wrong.
Oh my gosh. And Melkor just loses it, and he is very mad, and he's like, I'm not gonna give you the Silmarils. And because they have this light in them, and it mentions in a previous chapter that if any kind of like darkness or evil tried to touch them, that like they would be burned or something. And so he's holding the Silmarils, and they are literally like burning his hand and causing him pain, but he refuses to let them go. So Ungoliant throws a tantrum too and runs off. It says she flees down into Beleriand, into a valley called Non-Dungortheb, the Valley of Dreadful Death. Okay. And it says she bred there, for foul creatures of spider's form had dwelt there since the days of the delving of Angband, and she mated and devoured them. And it says that like even after all of this, her offspring would stay there. So is that the beginning of Mirkwood by any chance?
Not exactly, but I mean,
I always think I'm onto something cool.
No, well, you are in a way. There's a lineage there. Think about Shelob. Shelob is Ungoliant's child. We're told that in the Lord of the Rings. Ungoliant is mentioned in the Lord of the Rings in the chapter of Shelob's lair. So she's the last child of Ungoliant. So these creatures that she's creating in Nan Dungortheb, with these other spider creatures that were already there, one of those is Shelob, who ends up in Mordor. And then we're told that these great spiders in Mirkwood are Shelob's children. So So yeah, you are right, but there's another step there, because Shelob.
Okay.
Shelob is the mother of the spiders of Mirkwood.
Got it. Yeah.
We don't know who Shelob's father is, but we do know that Ungoliant ate him.
Nice, solid.
as a spider does, that's it's a thing in nature. So yeah. So in my videos on my Silmarillion series on YouTube, obviously I use the imagery of the spiders and stuff. I have learnt now that I have to put a trigger warning for people when I start talking about spiders, because there's a lot of arachnophobes out there in the world, and but yeah, people aren't too keen on too graphic of a representation of that element of the story sometimes.
Yeah. And so it says, of the fate of Ungoliant no tale tells, yet some have said that she ended long ago, when in her uttermost famine she devoured herself at last. That's so cool. I love that's just so cool. So I guess that's the end of Ungoliant.
Pretty much, yeah. We never see
her again.
Yeah, there was a version.
That's a bummer.
There was a version of like the end of the Silmarillion story where she does come back actually at one point and fights Eärendil at the end of the story, which obviously we haven't gotten to yet. But yeah, in the published version of the Silmarillion and in most versions of the story that Tolkien wrote, she just disappears and disappears into darkness and devours herself. Which is, I think, a fitting end for sure.
I think it's so cool. That's so cool, yeah.
Yeah. This, if you remember the Lord of the Rings as well, something similar is said about Shelob as well, right? She basically, we never really see her die. Sam kind of wounds her and takes one of her eyes out and stuff. But then the same thing is said of her, really. She just disappears into the darkness and perhaps she devoured herself. I think, it's similar sort of imagery that's used about her end. Some say that she devoured herself. I like this some say in the Silmarillion, it's kind of myths within a myth.
Yeah, exactly. It's very much like, it makes it feel much more like this is folklore. These are stories that are being like told around a campfire or something, that like these are our history, that is, because that's what's so fascinating about like written language and folklore and everything, is that like these are how stories and history were told. Were just like first in like verbal tellings of everything, and it's just like so fascinating to like look back at the history and things, and then get to the point where they're finally being written down in some capacity. And The idea of like, you know, a camp counselor with like little elven children being like, and some say she went into the darkness and devoured herself, and then like someone else jumps out from behind the bushes and scares them all, you know, like.
I want to go back a bit because we missed something.
Yeah, sure.
It was Ungoliant almost overwhelms Melkor, so she basically she gets the better of him in the face off that they have, and you know, we were previously told that in chapter 1 Melkor was like this mountain that walks, that his head is in the clouds, and he seems like this giant godlike all-powerful figure at the beginning, and he's changed already, Melkor, at this point in the story, because he's less powerful than he was at the beginning of the story, and there's a reason for that. He puts his power out into other beings, into other creatures, and so he's already fought this war of the powers with the Valar already, which we've heard about. He's already empowered the Balrogs, and when he does that, he lessens himself, because some of himself leaves him and goes into these other beings that he empowers in that way. And in the lore, in some of the notes and the other things that we've got on the Silmarillion storyline, we do know that he's also put some of his power into Ungoliant, so he empowers her in order for his plan to assault Valinor to work. He gives her some of his power, so that's why she's able to overpower him. It says, but Ungoliant had grown great, and he less by the power that had gone out of him. And she rose against him, and her cloud closed around him, and she enmeshed him in a web of clinging thongs to strangle him. And then at that point, they're by Angband, and so some Balrogs come out and kind of help out Melkor, and the Balrogs must be fast. The Balrogs must be really, really fast. You think about the Balrog in like the Peter Jackson movie that just sort of stomps like quite slowly. I mean, it's big, so it moves quickly, really, but it's kind of stomps, and it doesn't come particularly quickly to assault the Fellowship in Moria. Even in the book, actually, I think the Balrog in the book is sort of described differently to how I might imagine the Balrogs in the Silmarillion. The Balrogs are never really described in much depth in the Silmarillion, but one thing that we can say about them is that they must have been quick at traveling, because they seem to just get there really quickly. Because it's miles away, the entrance to Angband. It's not it's not close particularly, and he lets out this giant cry, this roar that it becomes part of it. The region where he is assaulted by Shelob there is named after this cry that he lets out, and it's said that I don't know the exact quote. Maybe you can find it.
I can't find it either, but it was something like his cry is echoed there for like years afterwards. Yeah,
you can still hear this noise that he lets out for years afterwards, and it's
again adding that to the camp counselor story that's being told of like, some say you can still hear his screams being echoed. Maybe we'll hear them now if we're quiet. And then they get quiet, and then that's when the other camp counselor jumps up and scares everyone.
We should move on, because I've taken us back a moment, and we should keep going forward.
So what's his name? So Melkor goes to Angband and kind of grows in power, and I guess is coming back from this. And so he keeps the Silmarils. They're in his power. And he forged for himself a great crown of iron, and he called himself King of the World. In token of this, he set the Silmarils in his crown. And remember, the Silmarils are burning him. His hands were burned black by the touch of those hallowed jewels, and black they remained ever after. Nor was he ever free from the pain of the burning and the anger of the pain. So these are physically hurting him, burning him, and the pain is making him angry. And so like it's all kind of feeding off of each other, of course. But just like, classic metaphor of like holding on so desperately to the very thing that is hurting you, and like the idea of like power weighing so heavily and physically harming you and whatnot, and if you just like let go, then you wouldn't be in this situation. But like, it's harming him, and the pain is making him angry, and then that's making him more evil, and yeah, all just a vicious cycle.
It's almost a bit like the reverse of the Rings of Power in a way, or of the One Ring in particular, because the Silmarils have been hallowed by Varda. The Silmarils have been hallowed by Varda, and so she kind of blesses them with her holy power, but the light that's trapped within them is this temptation for Melkor, and he can't help himself. He covets the light itself, being a being of darkness, and he's driven to possess them at his own, at his own detriment. It hurts him to hold them, and he can't help himself. Really interesting theme in the Silmarillion is light. The thing about the light is that it becomes splintered over time because it's separated into the Silmarils and stored in the Silmarils and preserved there, and then what happens to the Silmarils later on happens. But then one of them we already know about from the Lord of the Rings, because the glass of Galadriel holds one of the light of the Silmarils that's collected from the stars.
I did not know that.
No? So this is why I said to you before we started recording, like, rereading The Lord of the Rings after reading the Silmarillion is an interesting experience.
Oh, cool. Okay.
Yeah. The light that's stored within the Silmarils is really important, because it's there's the pure light of the trees to begin with, but then it becomes splintered over time and diluted over time. And it's kind of like this metaphor for how the world diminishes over time. It's a very sort of medievalist perspective about how things were awesome back in the mythic days, prehistoric mythic days of yore, and now things are become less so, and the world diminishes over time, kind of like an entropy, sort of like a theological entropy that we're headed towards.
Funny how even back then people were like, man, wasn't it so great 100 years ago? And then I guess we'll just be doing that for the rest of time, is looking back at things and being like, wasn't it so great then? And it's like, I don't know, I kind of like having internet. I like the internet and indoor plumbing, so... Yeah,
I'm with you there on those particular points, yeah, for sure. I don't know.
The physical state of the world, however, of course, is terrible and is on fire. So, anyway... And that is where we are going to leave this week's episode. Dana and I talked for 2 hours because, as we said at the beginning of the episode, it's a very dense chapter. A lot happens. Even a 2 to 3 page chapter of the Silmarillion can take up a full episode of conversation. So I figured going into this that it would turn into a 2-parter, and sure enough it did. So this week was all about Melkor and our girl boss Ungoliant, and next week we will hear about Feanor, and spoiler alert, he continues to be the absolute messiest. That's What I'm Talking About is a proud member of WBNE. If you want to learn more about the network, you can go to WBNE.org, where you will find all of our shows like Curly Critics. The cover art is by Vaishon Brandon. You can support him on Instagram at Vaishon Designs. You can get merch for That's What I'm Talking About by going to tpublic.com/user/talkingaboutpod. You can find the podcast on social media at talkingaboutpod. You can find me on Twitter at MCWatsup and Instagram at MCTurndownForWhat. You can support the podcast by becoming a patron. Go to patreon.com/talkingaboutpod to explore the different tiers and perks that are available. If you are a member of the 11sies tier, you get access to bonus content. I've been doing some mini-sodes with some of my guests after the show, where we talk about a piece of media that they recommend for people to watch or listen to or read, etc. And this week, 11sies members got access to the full episode on Chapter 9, both of the parts, so that they could hear it all at once, rather than having to wait 2 weeks to hear both parts. So if that sounds like it interests you, you can become a member of the 11sies tier, or you can become a sponsor of the podcast, like Amen. Amen. Thank you so much for becoming a patron. I saw on Discord recently that you approved my pronunciation of your name, so thank you for doing that. And thank you for your support. To close out this podcast, I will read a review that someone left. If you also want to say nice things and leave nice words, please do so on Apple Podcasts. Tori from Wisconsin left a very long, lovely review, so I won't read all of it, but she says, or they, I won't assume whatever pronouns you go by. I have listened to approximately 5 minutes of this podcast, and I already love it so much. Lord of the Rings is one of my main fandoms right after Harry Potter. I really love your opinions, and I like how you're just another person reading a book for the first time. And then at the very bottom, they went in and added an edit in all caps. Stop dissing the world building. The poems are totally necessary. Tom Bombadil is god tier, awesome, and not a horror movie. Okay, I agree with you that Tom Bombadil is god tier awesome, but he's a little bit terrifying. He's just a little bit terrifying. If you don't find Tom Bombadil terrifying, I dare you to be dropped in the woods at night by yourself, knowing that Tom Bombadil is somewhere out there. And that's what I'm talking about.